Nobody had saved Eleanor Whitmore's seat. That was the first thing she noticed when she stepped into the conference room at Harper & Wells. Not the polished mahogany table, not the framed law degrees on the wall, not the silver tray of coffee cups near the window. The seat, or rather, the absence of one. Her family had arrived before her. Her oldest son, Michael, sat near the front with his wife beside him, one hand resting over a leather folder as if he were already preparing to sign something important. Her daughter, Rachel, sat by the window, scrolling through her phone with the tired expression of someone who had taken an early flight and wanted everyone to know it. The grandchildren sat together along the sidewall, whispering, checking messages, glancing up only when someone mentioned the estate. They were all there. Children, grandchildren, a niece from Denver, a nephew Eleanor had not seen since Harold's 70th birthday. Even people who used to say they were too busy for Thanksgiving had somehow found time for the reading of Harold Whitmore's will. But no one had saved a chair for Harold's wife. For 54 years, Eleanor had been Mrs. Whitmore. For 54 years, she had stood beside Harold through mortgages, layoffs, surgeries, Christmas mornings, college tuitions, family arguments, and every quiet Sunday dinner that somehow became the glue holding everyone together. And now, 3 months after burying him, she was standing near the door of a lawyer's office, holding her old brown handbag with both hands, waiting for someone to notice that there was nowhere for her to sit. No one did. Michael saw her first. His eyes moved toward her, paused for a moment, then shifted away. Not cruelly. That would have been easier to understand. He simply looked away the way busy people look away from something inconvenient. Rachel lifted her head next. "Mom," she said softly, as though greeting her in a church lobby rather than at the reading of her husband's will. Eleanor smiled. She had become very good at small smiles, the kind that made other people comfortable, the kind that said, "Don't worry about me," the kind Harold used to hate. "You don't have to. Make yourself smaller just because they don't know how to make room," he once told her. That had been years ago, after a Thanksgiving dinner when the children had argued for 40 minutes about work, mortgages, and school districts, while Eleanor carried dishes in and out of the kitchen without anyone asking if she wanted to sit down. Harold had found her later, standing alone at the sink with her hands in warm, soapy water. He had dried the plates beside her in silence. Then he had taken her hand under the kitchen light and said, "Ellie, one day they'll realize who kept this family from falling apart." She had laughed then, not because it was funny, because she did not believe him. A young assistant from the law office finally stepped out from behind the reception desk. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry." The young woman disappeared into the hallway and returned with a folding chair. It was placed near the back wall, behind the grandchildren, behind the cousins, behind a potted plant with glossy green leaves. Eleanor thanked her and sat down carefully, smoothing the front of her navy dress across her knees. It was the same dress she had worn at Harold's funeral. She had not planned that. At least, she told herself she had not. The room smelled faintly of coffee, printer paper, and expensive cologne. Someone near the table was discussing property values in Westchester. Another voice murmured something about taxes. A grandson Eleanor loved very much, though he rarely called, whispered, "Do you think Grandpa left the lake house to Uncle Mike?" His sister whispered back, "Probably." Dad said Grandpa wanted things handled responsibly. Responsibly. The word landed somewhere deep inside Eleanor. Harold had used that word differently. To Harold, responsibility meant showing up. It meant calling when you said you would. It meant taking the smaller piece of pie so someone else could have the larger one. It meant driving 2 hours in the rain because your daughter said her baby had a fever and her husband was out of town. It meant sitting beside your wife at night when her hands hurt from arthritis, pretending not to notice when she could no longer open jars by herself. 2. This room, responsibility seemed to mean assets, documents, ownership, control. Eleanor lowered her eyes to her handbag. Inside it, wrapped in a soft handkerchief, was the small silver music box Harold had given her on their first Christmas as husband and wife. It no longer played clearly. The tune sometimes slowed in the middle, as if the old mechanism had grown tired. But Eleanor carried it anyway. She had started doing that after the funeral. At first, she kept it on her nightstand. then in her coat pocket, then in her handbag. It was not valuable, not in the way people in this room understood value. But Harold had bought it when they had almost no money from a little antique shop with fogged windows and a bell over the door. He had been 26, nervous, and proud of himself for finding something he thought looked beautiful enough for her. "This is all I could afford," he had said. Eleanor had opened the tiny box and listened to the thin, delicate music. Then she had looked at him and said, "Then it's perfect." She touched it now through the fabric of her bag. For a moment, her breathing steadied. Then the door opened. Daniel Harper entered the room carrying 2 folders and a sealed envelope. The conversations died quickly, not out of respect, out of interest. Daniel was nearly 60 now, with silver hair, tired eyes, and the careful manner of a man who had spent his life delivering news people thought they wanted. He greeted the family quietly, then looked toward Eleanor. Not just a glance, a real look, one that lasted long enough for Michael to notice. Eleanor felt something move through the room, a small discomfort, a question no one had yet spoken. Daniel took his seat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming." Chairs shifted. Phones were turned face down. Michael leaned forward. Rachel crossed her arms. Someone cleared their throat. Eleanor sat at the back, hands folded over her handbag. Daniel opened the first folder. He began with the expected formalities. Harold's full legal name, date of signing, witness statements, executor details. Everything sounded distant and clean, the way legal language always did, as if grief could be. Organized into paragraphs. The family listened politely, but Eleanor knew they were waiting for numbers. Houses, accounts, heirlooms, promises they believed Harold had made. Daniel read through the first section. The house on Briar Lane, the lake property, several investment accounts, a charitable donation Harold had arranged for the Veterans Hospital. Michael nodded at that, though Eleanor wondered if he remembered Harold volunteering there every Tuesday after retirement. Daniel continued. Then he stopped, only for a second, but Eleanor felt it, a pause so small that most people might have missed it. Daniel looked down at the page, then at the sealed envelope beside his folder, then at Eleanor. This time, more people noticed. Michael's expression tightened. Rachel sat up straighter. The room, which had been leaning toward money, suddenly leaned toward mystery. Daniel removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the table. "There is one additional instruction from Harold," he said. Michael frowned. "Additional instruction?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Rachel glanced at the envelope. "What kind of instruction?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He rested his hand on the envelope. It was cream-colored, sealed, and marked in Harold's handwriting. Eleanor recognized the handwriting at once. The slightly slanted letters, the firm pressure of the pen, the way he always made his capital E look almost too elegant. Her breath caught, because written across the front, in Harold's hand, were 3 words. For Eleanor first. No one else could read them from where they sat. But she could, and Daniel knew she could. Michael looked from the envelope to the lawyer. Dad never mentioned another envelope. Daniel's voice remained calm. "No." He asked that it not be mentioned until today. A silence moved across the room. Not peaceful silence, the kind that makes people aware of their own thoughts. Eleanor heard the faint hum of the air conditioner, the soft tap of Rachel's fingernail against her phone case. Someone's chair creaked. Daniel looked around the room, then spoke more slowly. Harold left 2 envelopes. Michael's face changed. Rachel stopped tapping. The grandchildren looked up from their phones. Eleanor's hand closed around the music box inside her handbag. Daniel continued. "The first concerns the estate." He looked at the sealed envelope. "The second concerns the truth." No one moved. No one spoke. Then Daniel turned the envelope slightly, so the family could see Harold's handwriting for themselves. For Eleanor first. And for the first time that afternoon, every person in the room turned to look at the woman they had left sitting in the back. Nobody spoke. For a few seconds, the room seemed to forget how. The envelope remained on the table between Daniel Harper's hands. For Eleanor first. The words sat there quietly. Yet somehow they felt louder than anything that had been said all afternoon. Michael was the first to break the silence. "What truth?" His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm people use when they're trying very hard not to sound worried. Daniel looked at him. The kind your father believed should be heard by everyone in this room. Michael leaned back in his chair. Rachel folded her arms tighter across her chest. One of the grandchildren exchanged a glance with another. The atmosphere had changed. 10 minutes earlier, everyone had been waiting to hear what they would receive. Now, they were wondering what Harold had known. And those were very different questions. Daniel left the envelope unopened. That surprised everyone, especially Eleanor. If Harold had left a message, why not read it immediately? Why let the tension build? Daniel seemed to sense the question. Before I open this envelope, there are several things Harold wanted me to say. A cousin groaned softly. Michael sighed, but Daniel continued. He was very clear about the order. Eleanor almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Harold. For most of his life, people mistook his kindness for softness. They assumed that because he rarely raised his voice, he rarely made decisions. The truth was quite different. When Harold believed something mattered, nobody changed his mind. Not even Eleanor. Especially not Eleanor. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 30 years earlier, a snowy December evening, the family gathered around their kitchen table. The children arguing over where to spend Christmas. One wanted Florida, another wanted New York, a third wanted to stay home. Everyone talking, nobody listening. Harold had remained silent through most of it. Then he had simply said, "We'll spend Christmas together." And somehow the discussion had ended. Not because he demanded obedience, because everyone knew he meant it. Daniel opened a small leather notebook. The pages looked worn, used, personal. This notebook contains notes from my final meetings with Harold. The room became quiet again, a different kind of quiet, curiosity replacing impatience. Daniel adjusted his glasses. Then he began reading. People think inheritance is about deciding who gets what. He paused, then continued. They're wrong. No one moved. Inheritance reveals what people valued while you were still alive. The sentence seemed to land differently on every person in the room. Eleanor felt it immediately. Michael frowned. Rachel stared at the table. One of the grandchildren shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Daniel continued reading. Money doesn't change people. Another pause. It exposes them. The room felt smaller, almost warmer, as if the air itself had become heavier. Eleanor lowered her eyes, because she knew something nobody else did. Harold had not spent the last years of his life thinking about money. He had spent them thinking about people, about family, about distance, about the strange loneliness that can exist even when surrounded by those you love. Especially then, 3 years before his death, Harold had started keeping track of phone calls. Not officially, not on purpose, just small notes. A calendar on his desk, tiny marks beside certain dates. Michael called. Rachel called. Grandson visited. Birthday forgotten. Eleanor had found the calendar one afternoon while cleaning. When she asked about it, Harold laughed and closed the notebook. Nothing important. But later that night, after he thought she was asleep, she saw him staring at those pages. Not angry, not resentful, just disappointed. Not because his family didn't love him, because everyone assumed there would always be more time. Daniel turned another page. The next part was written 6 weeks before Harold passed away. The room became still. The saddest thing about growing old isn't becoming invisible. He stopped. Even Daniel's voice seemed affected now. Then he continued. It's watching the people you love slowly stop seeing each other. No one looked at anyone else. A grandson lowered his gaze. Rachel blinked rapidly. Michael stared straight ahead. Eleanor felt a sharp ache in her chest, because she remembered exactly when Harold wrote those words. The night after Thanksgiving, the family had gathered. The house had been full. Children, grandchildren, laughter, football games on television, pies cooling on the kitchen counter. The perfect holiday from the outside. Yet Harold had gone to bed early. When Eleanor followed him upstairs, she found him sitting alone on the edge of the bed. "What's wrong?" she asked. Harold had smiled. That same quiet smile. Then he said, "Did you notice?" "Notice what?" "No one asked your mother a single question all day." Eleanor remembered standing there in silence. Because he was right. Her mother had been 86. She had traveled 4 hours to be there. and nobody had asked about her stories, her memories, her life. Everyone loved her, yet somehow nobody truly saw her. That night, Harold sat awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. And 6 weeks later, he wrote those words. The room in the law office felt colder now. Daniel slowly closed the notebook. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Rachel finally broke the silence. What does any of this have to do with the envelope? The question sounded sharper than she intended. Daniel looked toward her, then toward Eleanor. Finally, he rested his hand once more on the sealed envelope. Everything. Michael frowned. What exactly are you saying? Daniel hesitated. Not because he didn't know, because he understood what would happen next. The room sensed it too. Something important was approaching. Something irreversible. Daniel looked down at the front of the envelope, then carefully turned it over. On the back was another line written in Harold's handwriting, a line nobody in the room had seen before. Daniel read it aloud. If you're hearing this message. He stopped. The room held its breath. Then he finished reading. Then my greatest fear came true. And suddenly nobody was thinking about the inheritance anymore. Nobody was thinking about the inheritance anymore. At least, that was what it looked like. But Daniel Harper had spent more than 30 years handling wills, estates, and family disputes. He knew better. People rarely stopped thinking about money. What changed was the order of their concerns. For the first time that afternoon, everyone in the room seemed uncertain. Not about what they might gain, about what they might learn. Daniel let the silence linger. He had learned something else over the years. Silence often revealed more than questions. Michael was the first to speak. What did Dad mean by that? No one needed clarification. Everyone knew he was referring to the line. If you're hearing this message, then my greatest fear came true. Daniel folded his hands together. He never explained it directly. Michael's jaw tightened. Then how do you know what he meant? The lawyer looked at him calmly. Because I knew your father. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Across the room, Rachel lowered her eyes. Eleanor noticed. It was a small movement, but mothers notice small things, especially when they have spent decades watching their children become strangers. Rachel used to call every Sunday, every single Sunday, when she was 22, when she was 30, even when she moved across the country. Then life became busier. Children arrived. Work became demanding. The calls became shorter, then occasional, then irregular. Nobody meant for it to happen. That was the cruel thing. Distance rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one missed call at a time, one postponed visit at a time, one holiday at a time, until one day, everyone realizes they have become guests in each other's lives. Daniel opened the leather notebook again. Harold spent the final years of his life thinking about a question. The room listened. What question? Rachel's voice was almost a whisper. Daniel glanced at the page. Then read. At what point does a family stop being connected and start simply being related? Nobody moved. The sentence settled over the room like a weight, because every person understood it, and every person hoped it applied to someone else. Michael leaned back. I don't think that's fair. Daniel looked up. No, my father wasn't abandoned. No one said he was. But that's what this sounds like. Daniel closed the notebook. For a moment, he looked tired. Not physically, emotionally, as though he had carried this conversation for months. Your father never believed he was abandoned. That surprised everyone, including Eleanor, because if she were honest, she had occasionally feared exactly that. Not for herself, for Harold. Daniel continued. He believed something much sadder. The room became still. What? Rachel asked. The lawyer hesitated, then answered. He believed everyone loved each other. A pause. He just wasn't sure anyone was paying attention anymore. The words hit Eleanor harder than anything she had heard so far. Because they were true, painfully true. Harold had never questioned whether his family loved him. He questioned whether they saw one another. There was a difference, a huge difference. And somewhere along the way, many people stopped noticing it. A memory returned to Eleanor. 3 winters earlier, a Sunday evening, the family gathered at Harold and Eleanor's home. One grandson discussing college, another talking about a promotion, Rachel answering work emails between conversations, Michael taking calls from clients. The house had been full. The noise had been constant. Yet later that night, Harold stood at the kitchen sink and quietly said, "Did you notice nobody asked how your doctor's appointment went?" Eleanor remembered laughing, not because it was funny, because she had not noticed either. Harold had. He always noticed. That was the strange thing about him. He paid attention to everyone. The waitress having a difficult day, the neighbor recovering from surgery, the mailman whose wife was sick, the cashier whose mother had passed away. Harold remembered details, birthdays, names, stories, people. Perhaps that was why loneliness hurt him differently, because he gave attention so freely and slowly realized how rarely people gave it back. Daniel turned another page. 6 weeks before his death, Harold asked me to record a list. A list of what? Michael asked. The lawyer looked at him. A list of moments. Nobody understood. Daniel continued. Not financial transactions. Not assets. Moments. The room exchanged confused glances. Then Daniel began reading. The afternoon Rachel called just to hear her mother's voice. Rachel's eyes widened. Daniel continued. The night Michael drove through a snowstorm because his sister's car broke down. Michael looked down. The Christmas when everyone squeezed into the old house because nobody wanted Grandma sitting alone. A granddaughter blinked rapidly. Daniel turned another page. The day my grandson spent 2 hours teaching me how to use a smartphone and never once acted impatient. The room was silent because nobody expected this. These were not the things people usually left behind. Not in wills. Not in legal documents. Not in inheritance meetings. Daniel lowered the notebook. Your father believed those moments were the real inheritance. No one spoke. Even Michael. Even the cousins. Even the grandchildren. The room seemed to be seeing Harold differently. Not as a man who owned things, but as a man who remembered things. The distinction mattered, more than anyone wanted to admit. Then Daniel slowly reached for the envelope. The movement immediately captured everyone's attention. The room tightened again. Curiosity returned. Not greed. Not yet. Something deeper. Fear. Hope. Regret. Daniel ran his finger along the edge of the envelope, then stopped. His eyes moved toward Eleanor. For a moment, neither spoke. Yet something passed between them. An understanding. A shared memory of the man everyone else was only beginning to rediscover. Then Daniel said quietly, "Before I open this envelope, there is one thing all of you should know." Nobody interrupted. Nobody breathed. Daniel looked directly at Michael, then Rachel, then the grandchildren. Finally, Eleanor. The second envelope was never meant to reward the person your father loved most. The room froze. Daniel's voice softened. It was meant to reveal whether anyone truly understood him. And suddenly, for the first time that afternoon, Eleanor felt afraid of what might come next. Eleanor did not like the feeling growing inside her chest. Fear, not the kind that comes from danger, the kind that comes from memory. Because as Daniel Harper reached for the envelope, she suddenly realized something she had been avoiding for months. She had spent so much time grieving Harold's death that she had never fully considered what he had been carrying while he was alive. The room remained silent. No one seemed interested in the inheritance anymore. Or at least, that was the story everyone was telling themselves. The truth was more complicated. People rarely stop caring about money. But every now and then, something more important enters the room. And when it does, money becomes smaller. Daniel carefully unfolded the next page. The paper looked worn, not from age, from handling, as though Harold had revised these words more than once. That thought alone made Eleanor's throat tighten. Harold had never been the type to leave dramatic messages. If he had taken the time to write something like this, it mattered. It mattered deeply. Daniel looked down at the page, then began reading. If Eleanor is hearing this, then I need everyone else to do something first. The room immediately became alert. Michael leaned forward. Rachel lifted her eyes. Even the grandchildren seemed focused now. Daniel continued. I need you to listen. A pause. Not to me. Another pause. To her. The room became still. Eleanor felt every I turned toward her again. The attention made her uncomfortable. It always had. For most of her life, she preferred being behind the scenes, setting the table, organizing holidays, remembering birthdays, helping everyone else shine. Harold used to tease her about it. You disappear in your own life sometimes. She would laugh, then change the subject. Daniel kept reading. For 54 years, Eleanor remembered things that everyone else forgot. The sentence hit the room differently than the others. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded true, painfully true. Eleanor remembered Rachel's first broken heart, Michael's fear before his first job interview, the year her grandson wanted to quit baseball, the Christmas when money was so tight they wrapped secondhand gifts and pretended not to notice. She remembered allergies, favorite foods, birthdays, anniversaries, hospital visits, graduations, tiny details, thousands of them, the invisible threads that held a family together. And most of those memories lived only inside her now. Daniel turned another page. One day, I asked Eleanor why she remembers so much. A faint smile appeared on Eleanor's face. She remembered that conversation. They had been washing dishes. Nothing special, just dishes. Harold had dried a plate and asked, "How do you remember everything?" She had shrugged. "Because it's important." That was all she said. At the time, it seemed like a simple answer. Now, Daniel was reading aloud. Because it's important. The room remained silent. Then Harold's letter continued. It took me 40 years to understand what she meant. Eleanor lowered her eyes. For a moment, she wished Harold had not written any of this. Not because she disliked hearing it. Because she wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Not by an entire room. Daniel continued. The strongest people in a family are often the ones nobody notices. The sentence settled over the room. Michael stared at the table. Rachel looked toward her mother. Really looked. Perhaps for the first time that day. Perhaps for the first time in a long time. The room felt different now. Less like a legal meeting. More like a mirror. Everyone was beginning to see things they had avoided. Daniel slowly lowered the page. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. There's something else. His voice was softer now. Almost hesitant. Eleanor immediately felt her stomach tighten. Because Daniel knew things. Things Harold had never shared with the family. Things Harold had only shared with him. The lawyer reached inside the envelope again. This time he removed a photograph. An old photograph. Its edges were worn. The colors faded. Daniel stared at it for a moment. Then looked at Eleanor. The expression on his face changed. Respect. Sadness. Understanding. All at once. Rachel noticed. So what is it? She asked. Nobody answered. Daniel slowly turned the photograph toward the room. Every person leaned forward. Michael, Rachel, the grandchildren, the cousins, everyone. The image showed a much younger Eleanor, standing beside Harold, both smiling, both holding something in their hands. At first, nobody understood why the photograph mattered. Then Daniel read the note written on the back, and suddenly Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. Because she had not seen those words in more than 30 years. The note read, "The day Eleanor gave up her dream, so ours could survive." The room froze, and for the first time that afternoon, Michael whispered a question that nobody else had ever thought to ask. What dream? What dream? Michael's voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow it echoed through the room, because everyone realized the same thing at the same moment. They didn't know the answer. Not Rachel. Not the grandchildren, not the cousins, not even Michael. The question hung in the air while Daniel looked down at the photograph. Eleanor could not stop staring at it. The picture had been taken in the spring of 1988. She remembered the day clearly. The weather had been unusually warm. Harold had borrowed a camera from a neighbor. The two of them stood outside a small brick building in White Plains. Both smiling, both hopeful, both exhausted. At the time, neither of them knew the photograph would matter decades later. Daniel turned the picture over. The answer is in Harold's letter. No one interrupted. No one wanted to. The room had changed. Completely changed. The inheritance no longer felt like the center of the story. The family was beginning to discover something far more valuable. A version of Eleanor they had never known. Daniel resumed reading. When people tell the story of our family, they usually tell it wrong. A few people exchanged confused looks. The lawyer continued. They think I built our life. The room became still. They think I created our success. Another pause. They think I carried our family. Eleanor closed her eyes. because she already knew what came next. She had heard Harold say versions of it before, usually late at night, usually when nobody else was around. Daniel's voice softened. The truth is that Eleanor carried all of us. No one moved. Rachel looked toward her mother. This time, there was no distraction. No phone. No window. No escape. Only attention. The kind Eleanor had quietly given everyone else for decades. Daniel continued. Most of you know that I started Whitmore Construction in 1988. Michael nodded automatically. Everyone knew that story. It had become family history. The story of hard work. The story of risk. The story of success. The story repeated at birthdays, graduations, and holiday dinners. But Daniel kept reading. What most of you don't know is that the company almost never existed. The room became perfectly silent. Michael frowned. Rachel leaned forward. Even Eleanor felt her heart beating faster. Not because she didn't know, because she knew exactly where this was going, and she had spent 30 years making sure nobody else did. Daniel turned another page. In 1988, I was offered an opportunity. A pause. It required money we did not have. The lawyer looked down, then continued. The bank refused the loan. A few surprised expressions appeared around the room. No one had heard this story before. Michael certainly hadn't. The version he knew involved determination, persistence, a hardworking father overcoming obstacles, not failure, not rejection. Daniel continued. I came home that evening ready to walk away. Eleanor felt tears forming because she remembered the kitchen, the silence, Harold sitting at the table long after dinner, the untouched coffee beside him, the look of disappointment he tried unsuccessfully to hide. She remembered every detail, the color of the curtains, the sound of rain outside, the smell of tomato soup cooling on the stove. Memories preserved by love. Daniel read the next line. Eleanor listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. That sounded right. She had always listened first. Harold talked. She listened. That was how they worked. Then Daniel continued. When I finally stopped talking, she stood up, left the room, and returned carrying a small wooden box. Eleanor lowered her head. The room felt far away now, as though she were listening to someone else's life. Not her own. Inside that box had been her savings. Years of them. Small amounts collected over time. Money from extra shifts. Money from side jobs. Money saved carefully when nobody was looking. Daniel read on. She placed the box on the table and told me to take it. The room remained silent. No, I told her. Another pause. It's yours. Daniel's voice softened. Then he read Eleanor's answer. It's ours. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Because suddenly the photograph made sense. The note made sense. The envelope made sense. The story everyone thought they knew was changing. Daniel turned the page. The money in that box became the foundation of everything that followed. Michael stared at the floor. Rachel covered her mouth. A grandson looked toward Eleanor with an expression she had never seen before. Respect. Not the polite kind. The real kind. The kind born from understanding. Daniel continued. The company succeeded. The house was built. The children were raised. The life we created became real. A pause. But none of it begins with me. The room felt heavier, warmer, more emotional, as though Harold himself were somehow present, watching, remembering. Finally, Daniel lowered the letter. Then he looked directly at Michael. Did you know any of that? Michael slowly shook his head. No. Rachel's voice cracked. I didn't either. Eleanor wished they would stop looking at her. Not because she was uncomfortable, because she had never wanted credit. That had never been the point. The point had been family. Always family. Daniel picked up the photograph once more. Then he looked back at the letter. There is more. His voice was quiet now, almost reluctant, because the next section was different. More personal, more painful. The room sensed it immediately. Daniel turned to the next page. And for the first time since the reading began, Eleanor wished Harold had left some things unsaid, because she knew exactly what memory came next, and she wasn't sure she was ready for anyone else to hear it. For the first time since the reading began, Eleanor wished Harold had left some things unsaid, not because they weren't true, because they were. And some truths become harder to carry once other people finally see them. The room remained quiet. Nobody seemed interested in speaking. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever was unfolding. Daniel looked down at the next page of Harold's letter. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Eleanor to notice. And that was all it took. She knew. The memory was coming. The one Harold never forgot. The one she spent years trying to minimize. The one she hoped had disappeared into the ordinary passage of time. Daniel took a slow breath, then began reading. There is something else my family never knew. Eleanor closed her eyes. Not yet. Please, not yet. But Harold's voice, carried through Daniel, continued. 22 years ago, Eleanor gave up something much larger than money. The room became still. Michael frowned. Rachel glanced toward her mother. Neither of them understood. Not yet. Daniel continued. Most people know what a person does. Very few know what they gave up doing. The sentence lingered. Harold always had a way of seeing life from unusual angles. Eleanor used to tell him that. He would laugh and say, maybe everybody else is looking in the wrong direction. Daniel read on. When Rachel was 12, something happened that changed our family. Rachel immediately looked up. The mention of her name pulled her attention forward. Eleanor's heart sank because she remembered exactly what year Harold was talking about. The hospital, the uncertainty, the fear, the endless waiting rooms. Some memories never lose their shape. They simply become quieter. Rachel whispered softly, Mom. Eleanor did not answer. She could not. Daniel continued. Rachel became seriously ill. The room was silent. A grandson looked confused. A granddaughter seemed surprised. Many of them had never heard the full story. Why would they? Families often remember outcomes, not sacrifices. People remember that everything turned out fine. They rarely ask what it cost. Daniel turned the page. The doctors believed she would recover. Pause. But recovery would require time. Another pause. And attention. Eleanor felt tears forming. Not because of the memory itself, because she could suddenly see it through Harold's eyes. She had never done that before. She remembered hospital chairs, vending machine coffee, long nights, school papers spread across waiting room tables, trying to appear calm, trying to appear strong, trying not to let Rachel see how frightened she truly was. Daniel continued. At the time, Eleanor had been offered something she had worked toward for years. The room grew quieter, if such a thing was possible. Michael looked confused. Rachel looked confused. Everyone looked confused. Daniel read the next line. She was offered a teaching position at the music conservatory. Eleanor lowered her head. There it was. The dream. Not a fantasy. Not an impossible wish. A real opportunity. Years of work. Years of training. Years of practice. Years of hoping. Harold continued through the letter. It was the opportunity she had wanted since she was a young woman. Rachel's eyes widened. You taught music? The question escaped before she could stop it. Eleanor smiled sadly. Years ago. Rachel looked stunned. Why didn't I know that? The answer came from Daniel. Because Harold had already written it. Because she never talked about what she lost. The room felt heavy. The kind of heavy that arrives when people realize how little they know about someone they love. Daniel continued. The conservatory offered her a position she had spent years hoping for. A pause. 3 days later, she declined. No one moved. No one spoke. Eleanor remembered writing the letter. The acceptance package sitting on the kitchen table. The phone call. The excitement. The possibility. Then Rachel's diagnosis. The hospital. The uncertainty. And suddenly the decision had become obvious. At least to her. Daniel kept reading. I asked her if she was sure. Another pause. She said yes. One more pause. Rachel needs me more. The room fell silent. Not dramatic silence. Not shocked silence. Something deeper. The silence of people rearranging their understanding of the past. Michael looked toward his mother, then away, then back again, as though he were seeing two versions of her at once. The woman he knew, and the woman he never bothered to know. Daniel continued. She never mentioned it again. Not once. Rachel covered her mouth. Tears had appeared in her eyes. Mom. The word broke. Eleanor looked at her daughter. The same daughter she would make the same choice for again. Without hesitation, without resentment, without regret. That was the complicated thing about love. Sometimes it costs everything, and you still consider it worth it. Daniel lowered the page, then looked around the room. Harold underlined the next sentence 3 times. No one moved. Everyone waited. Daniel read it slowly. My family thinks Eleanor sacrificed one dream. A pause. Then the next line. The truth is that she sacrificed hundreds. Nobody spoke, because everyone suddenly understood. The music position, the trips never taken, the opportunities declined, the hobbies abandoned, the quiet desires postponed, the thousands of invisible choices that become a life. Daniel reached for the next page, then stopped. For a moment, he simply stared at it. Eleanor immediately knew why, because she remembered that page too. And unlike the others, this one wasn't about sacrifice. This one was about heartbreak, the kind Harold never forgave himself for. Daniel slowly looked up, then toward Eleanor, then back down at the letter. And for the first time all afternoon, his voice carried genuine emotion. Harold wrote this part only 6 days before he died. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, because suddenly everyone understood. The next words were not old memories. They were his final thoughts, and none of them were prepared for what came next. The next words were not old memories. They were Harold's final thoughts, and somehow that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, more fragile. Daniel stared at the page for a moment before speaking, as if even he needed a second. Then he began reading. 6 days ago, I sat at the kitchen table and watched Eleanor fall asleep in her chair. No one moved. The image was simple, ordinary. Yet Eleanor immediately remembered the evening, the lamp beside the sofa, the unfinished crossword puzzle, the soft blanket across her knees. She had not realized Harold was watching her. Daniel continued. She looked tired. A pause, the kind of tired that takes years to earn. Eleanor lowered her eyes, because Harold had always noticed exhaustion before she did. Not physical exhaustion, life exhaustion. The weight people carry when they spend decades taking care of everyone else. The weight they become so accustomed to carrying that they stop mentioning it. Daniel read on. I started thinking about all the things Eleanor gave our family. The room remained silent, and then I realized something that broke my heart. Michael shifted in his chair. Rachel wiped at her eyes. Nobody knew what was coming. Daniel's voice softened. I could remember almost every sacrifice she made. A pause, but I could not remember the last sacrifice someone made for her. The room froze. No one looked at anyone else, because suddenly the question belonged to everyone. When was the last time someone made life easier for Eleanor? Not thanked her, not hugged her, not sent flowers, actually sacrificed something for her. The silence answered before anyone could. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, not because she blamed her family. She didn't. That was the tragedy. Love had never disappeared. Attention had. Daniel continued. I spent 3 days trying to think of one example. Another pause. I couldn't. Rachel closed her eyes. Michael looked away. A grandson stared at the floor. The room felt heavier with every sentence. Harold's voice seemed to be reaching across time. Not accusing, not angry, simply honest, painfully honest. Daniel turned the page, then continued. I don't want my family to feel guilty. Eleanor almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Harold. Even now, he was protecting people. Even now, he was trying to soften the blow. I only want them to notice. A pause. Because unnoticed love slowly becomes loneliness. The sentence settled into the room. Nobody challenged it. Nobody could. Every person there recognized the truth. Maybe not in Eleanor. Maybe not in Harold. But somewhere in their own lives. An aging parent, a spouse, a friend, a neighbor, someone quietly carrying more than anyone realized. Daniel continued reading. There is one memory I have never shared. Eleanor immediately knew what was coming, and she wished she didn't, because this memory belonged to the two of them. Only the two of them, or so she thought. Daniel read slowly. 3 years ago, Eleanor forgot her birthday. The room looked confused. Rachel frowned. Michael blinked. What did that even mean? Then Daniel continued. Not everyone else. Eleanor. The room became still again. Eleanor remembered immediately. She had spent the entire day helping a granddaughter prepare for college. Driving, shopping, running errands, making phone calls, solving problems, doing what she always did, taking care of everyone else. At dinner, Harold asked, "What do you want for dessert?" She had laughed. "What?" And Harold had simply stared at her. "You don't know, do you?" The memory hit her with unexpected force. Daniel continued. She spent the entire day helping everyone else. A pause, and forgot it was her own birthday. The room felt different now. Not shocked, heartbroken. Harold's letter continued. That night, I realized something. Another pause. Eleanor had spent so many years putting herself last that she had disappeared from her own list. Rachel covered her face. The tears were no longer subtle. Michael looked as though someone had taken the air from his lungs. Daniel read on. I bought a small cake. A faint smile appeared on Eleanor's face through her tears. Harold had driven 20 minutes to find one. At 8 o'clock at night, in the rain, because he refused to let the day end that way. Daniel continued. We sat together at the kitchen table. The image felt alive. The cake, the candle, the quiet kitchen, the darkness outside. No guests, no celebration. Just two old people eating cake. A pause. But it may have been the most important birthday of her life. Eleanor wiped at her eyes. Because she knew why. Not because of the cake. Because of what Harold said afterward. Daniel turned to the next line and read it aloud. I asked Eleanor what she wished for. The room listened. Every person, hanging on every word. She said she already had everything she wanted. A pause. I knew she was lying. Several people laughed softly through tears. For the first time all afternoon. Because they recognized her. The way she protected people. The way she minimized her own needs. The way she always said she was fine. Daniel read the final sentence on the page. And when he did, Eleanor felt her heart break all over again. One day, I told her, I hope someone takes care of you the way you've taken care of everyone else. The room became completely silent. Not because of sadness. Because everyone suddenly understood. This letter wasn't really about the past. It was about now. About this room. About this family. About a question none of them wanted to answer. Had they? Had any of them? Daniel slowly lowered the page. His eyes moved across the room. Then toward the envelope. There were still pages remaining. Several of them. And whatever came next was important enough that Harold had placed it near the end. Daniel took a slow breath. Then looked directly at Eleanor. For the first time since the reading began, she looked frightened. Because she knew what was on the next page. And she knew that once it was read aloud, nothing in this family would ever be quite the same again. For the first time since the reading began, Eleanor looked frightened. Because she knew what was on the next page. And she knew that once it was read aloud, there would be no putting it back. Some truths remain hidden because people are ashamed of them. Others remain hidden because they are sacred. This truth belonged to the second kind. Daniel noticed the change in her expression. For a moment, he hesitated. Not because Harold's instructions were unclear. Because he understood what they would cost. Eleanor gave the smallest nod. It was enough. Harold had trusted Daniel. And Eleanor trusted Harold. The lawyer looked down at the letter and continued. If you have made it this far, then there is something I need all of you to understand. The room was silent. No shifting chairs. No nervous coughs. No whispered conversations. Only listening. Real listening. Perhaps for the first time in years. Daniel read on. There was a period of my life when I was angry with Eleanor. The statement surprised everyone. Even Rachel looked confused. Harold and Eleanor had always seemed inseparable. Steady. Reliable. The kind of couple younger generations quietly assumed would always exist. The idea that Harold had ever been angry with her felt impossible. Daniel continued. It lasted almost 8 months. Now, even Eleanor looked surprised. Not because it wasn't true. Because she had forgotten. Or perhaps forgiven it so completely that it no longer felt important. Daniel kept reading. When Michael left for college, I became obsessed with work. Michael lowered his eyes. The room listened. I told myself I was doing it for my family. A pause. Sometimes that was true. Another pause. Sometimes it was an excuse. The honesty in the sentence settled heavily over the room. Harold's voice felt different here. More vulnerable, less certain, more human. Daniel continued. I missed dinners. I missed birthdays. I missed ordinary moments that never come back. Eleanor closed her eyes. She remembered those years. The company was growing. The bills were finally manageable. The future looked brighter. Yet Harold was rarely home. When he was home, he was tired. When he wasn't tired, he was distracted. Neither of them talked about it enough. Many marriages don't break because of one large event. They drift, the way coastlines slowly change shape. So gradually nobody notices until years have passed. Daniel turned another page. One night, I came home after another 14-hour day. The room listened. The house was quiet. Another pause. Too quiet. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She remembered this story now. Perfectly. Daniel continued. Eleanor was sitting alone in the living room. The image appeared clearly in her mind. The lamp. The silence. The unfinished book resting on her lap. I asked what was wrong. A pause. She said nothing. Another pause. I asked again. Daniel's voice softened. Then he read the line that followed. She looked at me and said, I miss my husband. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because every person in the room understood immediately. She had not lost him. Yet somehow she had. The sentence carried a loneliness deeper than anger, deeper than accusation, deeper than blame. Eleanor remembered the look on Harold's face that night. Shock, then guilt, then understanding. Daniel continued. I wish I could tell you I changed immediately. A small pause. I didn't. The honesty hurt, because it felt real. Human beings rarely transform in a single moment. Growth is usually slower. Messier, Daniel read on. But I never forgot those words. The room remained silent. I miss my husband. Another pause. I heard them every day for years. Michael wiped at his eyes. Rachel stared at her hands. The grandchildren looked uncomfortable. Not because the story was dramatic, because it felt familiar. Many of them had probably said similar things, or thought similar things. About spouses, parents, children, friends. People can disappear emotionally long before they disappear physically. Daniel turned another page. Then came the line that made Eleanor's heart stop. 3 months before my diagnosis, I asked Eleanor a question. The room became still. Everyone knew Harold was approaching something important, something final. Daniel continued. I asked her if she regretted any of it. A pause. The dreams. The sacrifices. The years. The room waited. Because suddenly everyone wanted to know the answer. Especially Michael. Especially Rachel. Especially Eleanor. Daniel looked down at the page. Then read her reply. No. The simplicity of the answer made it even more powerful. No. Not maybe. Not sometimes. Not a little. No. Daniel continued. Then she said something I have never forgotten. The room held its breath. Eleanor felt tears gathering again, because she remembered exactly what she had said. Not because it was wise, because it was true. Daniel read slowly. The people I love were never standing in the way of my life. A pause. They were my life. The room broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Rachel began crying. Michael lowered his head. One of the grandchildren covered her mouth. And for the first time all afternoon, nobody seemed interested in looking away from their feelings. Daniel let the silence remain. Then he turned to the final section of the page. His expression changed. Not sadness. Something else. Something closer to awe. Because the next lines were not about the past. They were instructions. Specific instructions. Written directly for the people sitting in that room. And they explained why Harold had created the second envelope in the first place. Daniel took a breath, looked around the room, then rested his hand on the remaining pages. Everything you've heard so far, he said quietly, was only the reason. The room froze. Then he looked down at Harold's words. And what comes next was the purpose. And what comes next was the purpose. The words settled over the room like a change in weather. Until now, Harold had been explaining, remembering, reflecting. Now, for the first time, everyone sensed he was about to ask something of them. Daniel adjusted the pages in front of him. The remaining section of the letter was shorter, much shorter, Yet somehow it felt heavier than everything that came before. The lawyer began reading. If you are hearing this, then I can no longer sit at the table with you. A pause. I can no longer remind you to call each other. Another pause. I can no longer ask how you're really doing. The room remained silent. Harold's voice felt closer than ever. Not because he was present, because his absence was. Daniel continued. So, I decided to do one final thing. Michael stared at the letter. Rachel wiped away another tear. Nobody looked away. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody seemed interested in anything outside that room. Harold had their full attention, perhaps for the first time in years. Daniel read on. I created the second envelope because I wanted to leave something more valuable than money. The sentence felt familiar, yet what came next changed everything. I wanted to leave you a chance. The room froze. A chance? A chance for what? Daniel continued. A chance to become a family again. No one moved. No one spoke. Because suddenly the purpose of the envelope no longer seemed mysterious. It seemed personal, painfully personal. Harold's words continued. Families do not fall apart because they stop loving one another. A pause. They fall apart because they stop knowing one another. The sentence landed deeply. Michael lowered his eyes. Rachel stared at the table. A grandson thought about a grandfather he rarely visited. A granddaughter thought about a mother she only called when she needed something. Nobody was having the same thoughts. Yet everyone seemed to be feeling the same thing. Regret. Daniel continued. I spent years watching people I love become busier. Another pause. Then busier still. Another. Then unavailable. The room listened. Understood. A pause. Life is demanding. Another pause. But love requires attention. The sentence lingered. Because everyone knew it was true. Attention. Not intention. Not promises. Attention. The thing people always meant to give later. The thing later often stole away. Daniel turned the page. Only one page remained. The room noticed. So did Eleanor. Her heart beat faster. Because she knew they were approaching the center of everything. The reason Harold had waited. The reason he had trusted Daniel. The reason he had addressed the envelope. For Eleanor first. Daniel continued reading. Inside this envelope is a list. The room became alert. A list. Not money. Not property. A list. Harold continued. It contains 12 names. Confused expressions appeared immediately. Michael frowned. Rachel looked up. The grandchildren exchanged glances. Daniel kept reading. Each name belongs to a member of this family. Another pause. Beside each name is one memory. The room was silent. Eleanor suddenly understood. And when she did, tears appeared again. Because she knew exactly what Harold had done. Daniel continued. The memory beside each name is the moment I believe that person was most fully themselves. Nobody moved. The sentence seemed almost impossible to process. Not achievements. Not careers. Not income. Not status. Moments. Human moments. Daniel continued. The best version of themselves. A pause. The version I hoped they would never lose. Michael closed his eyes. Rachel stared at the letter. And for the first time all afternoon, Eleanor felt something she had not expected. Hope. Small. Fragile. But real. Because Harold was not trying to punish anyone. He never had been. He was trying to remind them who they were. Daniel read further. Before any inheritance is distributed, I asked Daniel to do something. The room immediately became tense. This was it. The instruction. The condition. The reason. Daniel continued. Each person must hear their memory. A pause. Then tell the family what they remember about it. The room stared in disbelief. Harold's voice continued. If they cannot remember, they may listen. Another pause. If they do remember, they may share. Another. If they cry, that's fine. A faint, bittersweet smile appeared on Eleanor's face. That sounded exactly like Harold. Daniel continued. But nobody leaves until they do. For the first time all afternoon, a soft laugh escaped somewhere in the room. Not because it was funny, because it was unmistakably Harold. Even after death. Still gathering everyone around the table. Still refusing to let them leave before the important conversation happened. Daniel lowered the page slightly, then looked around the room. The first name on the list is Michael. The room became still. Michael looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. Daniel turned the page, then frowned. A strange look crossed his face. Confusion, followed by surprise. Then something deeper, something emotional. The room noticed immediately. "What is it?" Rachel asked softly. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the memory written beside Michael's name for several seconds, as though he needed time to absorb what he was reading. Then he looked directly at Michael, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Michael," he paused. "Your father chose a memory from 32 years ago." The room leaned forward. Daniel swallowed, then looked back at the page. And suddenly Michael looked afraid. Because whatever Harold had remembered, Michael had completely forgotten. Because whatever Harold had remembered, Michael had completely forgotten. The room felt different now. Not tense, not fearful, expectant. Everyone seemed to understand that they were standing at the edge of something important. Not a secret, a revelation. Daniel looked back at the page, then began reading. Michael, age 14. Michael blinked. 14? The number alone surprised him. The room listened carefully. Harold's letter continued. It was February. Another pause. The coldest winter we had experienced in years. Michael stared at the table. Something distant seemed to flicker behind his eyes. A memory trying to return. Daniel continued. The furnace stopped working. Eleanor immediately remembered. The house had been freezing. Pipes threatening to freeze. Snow piled against the windows. Money was tight. Much tighter than the children ever knew. The company had not succeeded yet. The future was uncertain. The mortgage payment was due, and Harold had spent 2 days trying to repair the heating system himself. Daniel read on. We could only afford to heat one room. The room became quiet, not because the story was dramatic, because it felt real. The kind of hardship many families quietly carry. The kind children often never see. Daniel continued. Your mother and I told you everything was fine. A pause. It wasn't. Another pause. We were scared. Michael slowly lifted his eyes. His expression had changed, because now he remembered. Not everything. Pieces. Fragments. Snow. Cold. His mother's tired face. His father's forced optimism. Daniel continued. On the third night, Eleanor fell asleep at the kitchen table. The room listened. She had worked all day. Another pause. Then worked all evening. Another. And she still smiled when she looked at us. Eleanor felt tears forming again, because she remembered that smile, not the smile itself. The reason for it. Parents smile differently when they are worried. Children rarely notice, until they become parents themselves. Daniel continued. And then something happened. Michael suddenly sat forward. The memory was returning. Slowly, painfully. Harold's words continued. You walked into the kitchen carrying a blanket. The room became still. Michael froze. Daniel continued. You placed it over your mother's shoulders. A pause. You thought she was asleep. Another pause. So you never knew she saw you. Michael covered his mouth. The memory arrived all at once. The blanket. The kitchen light. The cold house. His mother sleeping in chair. The simple decision to cover her with a blanket. Nothing heroic. Nothing extraordinary. Just love. Daniel continued. You kissed her forehead. Rachel immediately began crying again. Michael lowered his head. The room felt heavy with emotion, because everyone understood. The memory wasn't important because of the blanket. It was important because Harold never forgot it. Daniel read the next lines. I watched from the hallway. A pause. And I remember thinking, another pause. He is becoming the kind of man I hoped he would be. The room was silent. Michael closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked 14 again. Not 52. Not a businessman. Not a father. Just a boy who loved his mother. Daniel continued. That is the version of you I never wanted you to lose. No one moved. No one spoke. Because suddenly the story was no longer about the past. It was about the distance between who people once were and who they had become. Daniel lowered the page, then looked directly at Michael. Do you remember it now? The room waited. Michael nodded slowly, unable to speak. Daniel waited. Eventually Michael cleared his throat, then spoke quietly. I remember. A pause. I haven't thought about that night in 30 years. The honesty in his voice changed something. Not only in him, in the room, because suddenly everyone realized how many important memories had been left behind. Not intentionally, simply buried beneath busy lives. Daniel nodded. Then read Harold's next instruction. Tell your family what you learned from that memory. Michael laughed softly through tears. A broken laugh. The kind people make when emotions arrive before words. Several seconds passed. Then he finally answered. I learned. His voice cracked. He started again. I learned that somewhere along the way. Another pause. I stopped paying attention. The room was silent. No one rushed to comfort him. No one interrupted. This moment belonged to him. Michael looked toward Eleanor. Really looked. Perhaps more honestly than he had in years. I thought providing for people was enough. A tear rolled down his cheek. I think I forgot that being present matters too. Eleanor felt her heart ache. Not from pain. From recognition. Because that was exactly the lesson Harold had hoped he would discover himself. Not through punishment. Through memory. Daniel carefully turned the page. The room watched. Everyone knew another name was coming. Another memory. Another piece of the family. Harold's final gift was beginning to work. Slowly. Quietly. One person at a time. Daniel looked down. Then smiled sadly. The next name is Rachel. Rachel froze. Daniel glanced at the memory beside her name. And unlike Michael's memory, this one made his eyes fill with tears immediately. Rachel's heart dropped because she suddenly knew whatever Harold had written, it wasn't something he remembered. It was something she should have remembered herself. The second envelope had never really been about them. It had always been about her. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not Michael. Not Rachel. Not the grandchildren. Not even Eleanor. The room seemed to hold its breath. Because suddenly everyone realized the same thing. All afternoon, they had been rediscovering Eleanor through Harold's eyes. And now they were about to discover how Harold saw her when nobody else was looking. Daniel looked down at the final page. The last page. The page Harold had written only days before his death. The page folded separately from the others. Carefully, deliberately, almost lovingly. Daniel's voice softened. Then he began reading. Eleanor. Nothing else. Just her name. For the first time all afternoon, the letter no longer sounded like Harold speaking to a room. It sounded like a husband speaking to his wife. The room immediately felt smaller, more intimate, more sacred. Daniel continued. If everyone else is hearing this, then please forgive me. A pause. This part was always meant for Eleanor. Another pause. But I think they need to hear it too. Eleanor felt tears gathering before the next sentence was even read. Because she already knew Harold. She knew the rhythm of his thoughts. The kindness hidden inside his honesty. The tenderness hidden inside his simplicity. Daniel continued. When I was young, I thought love meant protecting someone from hardship. A pause. Then I met Eleanor. A faint smile moved across the room. Even through tears, Daniel kept reading. And I realized love is often watching someone carry hardship with extraordinary grace. The room became silent again. Not because the sentence was dramatic. Because it felt true. Anyone who knew Eleanor knew it was true. She carried things quietly. Without complaint. Without announcement. Without needing recognition. Daniel continued. For 54 years, people complimented me. Another pause. They called me hardworking. Another. They called me successful. Another. They called me strong. The room listened. Then came the next line. Most of them were describing Eleanor. Rachel lowered her head. Michael wiped his eyes. No one argued. No one could. Daniel continued. I built a company. A pause. Eleanor built a life. Another pause. I earned a living. Another. Eleanor made it worth living. The room broke again. Quietly. Softly. The way hearts break when they finally encounter something true. Daniel paused before continuing. Because even he seemed affected now. Then he turned to the final section. The last section. Harold's final request. The reason for everything. The reason for the second envelope. The reason for the memories. The reason for the gathering. Daniel read slowly. If my family remembers only one thing from today, let be this. The room listened. Every person, every heart, every regret, Every memory. Harold continued. The most important people in your life are often the ones doing the quietest work. A pause. Notice them. Another pause. Before they become memories. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Because everyone knew exactly who Harold was talking about. Not only Eleanor. Their spouses. Their parents. Their children. Their friends. The people whose love had become so familiar that it had become invisible. Daniel turned to the final paragraph. The very last words. The last gift. The last goodbye. Eleanor. The room disappeared. At least for her. There was only Harold now. Only his voice. Only 54 years of life. Together. Daniel continued. If there is one regret I carry, it is this. A pause. I should have thanked you more. Tears rolled down Eleanor's face. Unstoppable now. Daniel kept reading. I should have noticed more. Another pause. I should have said it more often. Another. I should have spent less time assuming you knew. The room was silent. Harold's words continued. But in case I ever failed to say it enough. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. Then he finished reading. You were the greatest thing that ever happened to me. The room fell completely still. No movement. No sound. Only tears. Only truth. Only love. Daniel looked down. One final line remained. Just one. The last sentence Harold Whitmore ever wrote. He read it slowly. Take care of each other. A pause. And this time, another. Take care of Eleanor first. The letter ended. No dramatic twist. No hidden fortune. No secret inheritance. Only silence. Deep. Honest. Human silence. For several moments, nobody moved. Then something unexpected happened. Michael stood up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. He simply stood. Walked across the room. And sat down beside his mother. Rachel followed. Then a granddaughter. Then a grandson. One by one. Chair by chair. Until Eleanor was no longer sitting alone. No speeches. No promises. No grand declarations. Just presence. The thing Harold had wanted all along. The thing money could never buy. The thing the second envelope was really about. Eleanor looked around the room. At her family. At the faces she loved. At the people Harold had spent his final days trying to bring back to one another. Then she smiled. A real smile. The kind Harold always waited for. And for the first time since his death, she did not feel alone. Outside, snow began to fall softly against the windows. Inside, the family remained together. Talking. Remembering. Listening. Not because a lawyer told them to. Not because a will required it. Because they finally understood what Harold had spent a lifetime trying to teach them. That the real inheritance was never the house. Never the accounts. Never the company. The real inheritance was each other. And for the first time in a very long while, nobody seemed eager to leave.